In the cold winter of 1375, a shadow crept over the halls of Westminster Palace, a shadow that would mark the end of an era in English history. Sit back, relax, and let your mind drift into the world of a prince whose life had been defined by both glory and relentless struggle. Edward of Woodstock, the Black Prince, famed across Europe for his military brilliance, now faced a foe no sword could defeat his own failing body. The ailments that had haunted him since the Spanish campaign, mysterious and persistent, intensified with a merciless grip. Courtiers whispered in corridors, physicians worked tirelessly yet in vain, and the prince himself lay confined to his chambers, his once mighty frame visibly wasting away. The clatter of armor, the roar of battle, the triumphs that had echoed across French fields all, these were now memories, shadows of a life once defined by power and skill. Yet even in this weakened state, his mind remained a weapon of its own, sharp and unyielding, meticulously planning for the succession that would ensure his 10-year-old son Richard would inherit the throne without chaos. Documents were drafted, negotiations conducted, alliances reinforced. Each decision a subtle maneuver in the complex dance of English politics. Observers noted the stark contrast between the gaunt figure in ceremonial robes and the robust, commanding warrior of past campaigns. A man once unstoppable, now confined to bed, yet still exerting influence over a kingdom that trembled at the thought of losing him. Even as his physical form failed, Edward's presence in parliamentary sessions of early 1376 demonstrated that authority and intellect could outlast flesh. Representatives of the realm listened intently to his counsel on military strategy, fiscal reform, and international diplomacy, aware that the prince's reputation lent weight to every suggestion, every opinion. Across the Channel, French monarchs and their advisers followed news of his declining health with a mixture of relief and respect, recognizing a military genius whose absence would tilt the balance of power. Meanwhile, in the quiet moments between illness and duty, Edward devoted himself to the education of his young heir, imparting not just administrative knowledge, but lessons in loyalty, strategy, and the subtle art of leadership. And as winter deepened, the world watched silently, aware that the final chapters of the Black Prince's remarkable story were unfolding, each heartbeat bringing the inevitable question: what would remain when this legendary figure finally passed into history? As the icy winds of 1376 swept through the stone corridors of Westminster, the Black Prince's life hung in a fragile balance, each day a reminder of the relentless passage of time. The prince, once a towering figure on European battlefields, now moved through the world as a shadow of his former self, his body marked by the cruel toll of chronic illness that no physician could cure. Despite his frailty, his mind remained a fortress of strategy and foresight, meticulously orchestrating the delicate transfer of power to his son Richard, who at 10 years old would soon face a kingdom in turmoil. Every document signed, every conversation with noble families, every careful negotiation was steeped in an awareness of the precariousness of the moment. The Black Prince understood that a misstep could unravel the stability of England itself. Visitors arrived at his chambers with a hushed reverence, courtiers and officials alike treading lightly around the gaunt figure who still carried the authority of one who had commanded armies, shaped policy, and altered the course of war. The prince's attention to detail in preparing Richard for the throne was exhaustive, covering military strategy, governance, diplomacy, and the subtle lessons of political survival. In quieter hours, he reflected on his own campaigns, the victories at Crécy and Poitiers, and the costly miscalculations that had begun to erode English holdings in France. He understood that the reputation he had built as a warrior was now his most potent political tool, lending credibility and influence to his son even before Richard formally assumed the title of heir. Outside England, the continent reacted with cautious interest. French diplomats observed the decline of their formidable adversary with a mixture of relief and begrudging admiration, aware that the death of the Black Prince would remove a singular threat, but would not erase the legend that clung to his name. At the papal court, prayers were offered for his recovery, an acknowledgement not only of personal piety, but also of the intricate interplay between spiritual authority and secular power that had defined much of Edward's life. Within the prince's private chambers, plans for charitable donations, religious endowments, and support for veterans revealed a man acutely aware of legacy, determined that his name would endure not merely in chronicles of war, but in the moral and cultural fabric of the nation he had served. And so, amid the flickering candlelight, the whispers of courtiers, and the cold shadow of approaching death, the Black Prince prepared for the final acts of a life that had been extraordinary, leaving observers to wonder, what would history remember when the last breath had been drawn, and the sword of the Black Prince lay finally at rest? The Black Prince's influence over England's political landscape in his final months extended far beyond the walls of Westminster, reaching into the intricate web of noble loyalties and parliamentary manoeuvring that would shape the realm for years to come. Even bedridden, he remained a central figure in determining who would guide the young Richard during his minority, carefully weighing the ambitions, competence, and character of those who would serve as advisors and guardians. Each decision was a delicate balancing act. The prince knew that a single misjudgment could ignite factional disputes, destabilizing a kingdom already strained by war and economic pressures. His correspondence with John of Gaunt, who had taken over administration in Aquitaine, revealed a mind still attuned to the complex dance of feudal obligations, mercantile ties, and military logistics that governed English holdings abroad. He offered counsel on defending territories, maintaining alliances, and mitigating losses, though he recognized that without his personal presence, English authority in France was increasingly fragile. Meanwhile, at home, the political atmosphere simmered with anticipation and uncertainty, as nobles and courtiers alike positioned themselves for influence once the prince had passed. His death would leave a vacuum, one that no single figure could fully occupy, and even Edward III, hardened by decades of kingship, confronted the stark reality that the loss of his eldest son altered the succession and threatened the stability of the realm. Throughout all this, the Black Prince remained conscious of the cultural and symbolic dimensions of his legacy, commissioning literary works, supporting religious foundations, and ensuring that his tomb would communicate both his martial achievements and his devotion to Christian ideals. Canterbury Cathedral, chosen for its spiritual significance and strategic symbolism, would house a memorial combining the armor of a warrior with the piety of a prince, a permanent testament to a life lived at the intersection of violence, duty, and honor. Outside England, Europe watched with a mixture of awe and calculation. The French court, while eager to reclaim lost territories, could not ignore the enduring shadow of the Black Prince, a man whose reputation transcended national borders and whose legacy would continue to influence the balance of power long after his passing. As the prince's final days unfolded in the hushed chambers of Westminster, the sounds of quills scratching across parchment, the muted footsteps of courtiers, and the flickering light of candles illuminated a man whose mind remained alert and engaged, even as his body failed. And in those final, silent moments, the question lingered in the minds of those around him. How would England endure once the Black Prince, the unyielding force of war and wisdom, had disappeared from the stage of history? As June of 1376 approached, the atmosphere around Westminster Palace grew heavy with anticipation, grief, and the silent acknowledgement that a chapter in English history was nearing its close. The Black Prince, long celebrated as the indomitable warrior of Crécy and Poitiers, now faced the inevitable decay that had shadowed him for months. Courtiers moved quietly through the dim corridors, their footsteps echoing off cold stone walls, while scribes recorded the last directives of a prince intent on shaping a future he would never witness. His interactions with his young son Richard became increasingly poignant. In fleeting moments of clarity, he imparted lessons on governance, justice, and the responsibilities of command, aware that each word might be the foundation upon which the next king would build or falter. These sessions, conducted with a mix of stern authority and paternal care, touched on military strategy, the complexities of diplomacy, and the moral obligations that he believed a ruler must uphold, leaving a mental imprint on a child only 10 years old, yet destined to inherit unimaginable power. Outside the palace, the wheels of government continued to turn, but every meeting, every discussion, seemed to carry the shadow of his failing health. Parliament, aware of the prince's condition, treated his final participation as both a public affirmation of continuity and a private moment to witness the waning presence of a man whose influence had been unmatched. His contributions to debates on military funding, taxation, and the delicate balance of noble authority revealed a mind still sharp, still capable of navigating the treacherous currents of court politics, even as his body betrayed him. Meanwhile, news of his condition traveled swiftly across the Channel, drawing reactions from allies and adversaries alike. The French crown, ever calculating, prepared for the opportunities his death might present, while European chroniclers began to frame his legacy, contemplating a life that had blended heroic triumphs with controversial decisions, moments of mercy alongside acts of ruthless efficiency on the battlefield. Within the palace, the rhythm of daily life seemed almost suspended, punctuated by ritual prayers, the quiet arrival of advisers, and the soft murmur of instructions given from a bed where a once mighty prince now lay diminished. His consciousness of mortality sharpened every decision, every interaction, transforming Westminster into a nexus where personal duty, dynastic planning, and the weight of national expectation converged. And as the candlelight flickered across his chambers, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch into the future, the lingering question remained: how would the kingdom remember a man whose life had been defined by both glory and the inevitability of human fragility? The spring of 1376 saw Edward of Woodstock, the Black Prince, engage with matters of both personal and political consequence, a delicate balancing act as his illness deepened and his energy waned. Yet his mind remained alert, precise, and unwavering in its focus. The drafting of his will became not merely a legal necessity, but a canvas upon which he painted the culmination of a lifetime spent navigating war, governance, and the intricate web of nobility. Legal advisers, both from England and the continent, were summoned to ensure that his testament reflected not only the proper distribution of wealth and titles, but also the enduring influence, he wished to impart upon the realm and upon his son Richard, the boy who would soon bear the impossible weight of kingship. The will itself reveals a portrait of a man conscious of legacy, as it detailed charitable contributions to monasteries and hospitals, the establishment of religious foundations, and provisions for the care of soldiers who had fought under his banners. These acts of piety and foresight were coupled with instructions concerning the management of his lands, particularly those in Aquitaine, a region where his personal oversight had once secured English authority amidst the constant pressure of French ambition. Correspondence with his brother John of Gaunt, entrusted with the ongoing administration of these territories, reflected a mixture of realism and advice grounded in years of first-hand experience on the battlefield and in the courts of continental Europe. The Black Prince's awareness of his own mortality sharpened every word, every instruction, as he sought to prevent the collapse of the network's loyalties and military structures that had sustained his power. Yet even as he focused on political arrangements, he remained deeply invested in the education of Richard, orchestrating lessons on leadership, diplomacy, and morality that would form the intellectual and ethical framework for the future king. These lessons, delivered in moments of clarity between bouts of debilitating illness, conveyed a sense of urgency and purpose, the echo of a father's devotion and a commander's foresight, intertwining with the knowledge that he would soon be absent from both sun and kingdom. In these final months, the palace itself became a stage upon which the grandeur and fragility of medieval power were displayed. Courtiers, envoys, and clerics moved through corridors alive with whispered concerns, ceremonial pageantry, and the quiet hum of relentless duty. And while the prince's physical form weakened, his presence remained commanding, a reminder of the extraordinary life that had reshaped English identity, military prowess, and the very notion of chivalric ideals. Yet behind the ceremonial robes and the calculated diplomacy, a lingering shadow pressed upon every decision, the question of how England would survive, and who would truly fill the void left by a prince, whose life had straddled both legend and mortality. As the months progressed toward the summer of 1376, Edward of Woodstock's declining health became a matter not only of personal concern but of national consequence, for England stood at a crossroads between stability and uncertainty, the threads of succession and governance woven tightly around the fragile body of a man whose influence had dominated the past decades. Courtiers and officials moved carefully through the chambers of Westminster Palace, their conversations measured, their footsteps hushed, mindful that the presence of the Black Prince, even in weakness, carried a weight that could silence debate or sway opinion. Every visitor, every document signed, every decision made bore the imprint of a man whose reputation for strategic brilliance extended far beyond the battlefield. The air itself seemed charged with both reverence and tension, the faint scent of incense mixing with the distant echoes of armor and the low murmur of advisers deliberating over matters of war, tax, and law. The prince's body, gaunt and frail from the relentless progression of his digestive illness, contrasted sharply with the vibrant energy of his mind, which continued to map out the succession of his son, the future Richard II, and the protection of the political structures that would safeguard England during a time when both king and heir faced the inexorable march of time. In these final months, his correspondence with continental powers, French, Castilian, and Papal, revealed the careful diplomacy that had become a hallmark of his career, a blend of personal respect, strategic calculation, and a recognition that his death would resonate across Europe, potentially altering alliances and prompting renewed ambitions among rival monarchs. Some chroniclers note that letters from Charles V of France hinted at both relief and admiration. The King of France acknowledging the absence of a military adversary even as he recognized the enduring legend of a commander whose victories had reshaped French territorial ambitions. Within England, the prince's engagement with Parliament during the Good Parliament of 1376 demonstrated a subtle but decisive influence, supporting reform measures to improve fiscal accountability, curb corruption, and maintain noble cooperation, efforts that reflected both his concern for the immediate governance of the realm and his awareness of the long-term implications for his son's rule. And yet, amid legal negotiations, political strategy, and educational instruction for Richard, the Black Prince faced moments of reflection on mortality, chivalric honor, and the legacy he would leave behind. A contemplation that infused every action with an almost ceremonial gravity. As Westminster's halls grew quieter at night, the flickering torchlight casting long shadows across stone walls, one could sense the paradox of his final days, a life marked by unmatched martial prowess and political acumen, now reduced to fragile stillness, yet still shaping the destiny of a kingdom and echoing through the corridors of power in ways that would be felt long after his last breath. And so, England waited, poised on the precipice of change, for the inevitable end that would send ripples of consequence across the realm and beyond, leaving questions that history would ponder for centuries to come. The spring of 1376 brought with it a quiet intensity to Westminster Palace, a hush that seemed to settle over corridors where once the Black Prince's laughter and commanding voice had echoed, replaced now by the soft shuffle of attendants and the subdued murmurs of those who came to witness a fading presence, to seek counsel, or simply to pay respects to a man whose reputation had loomed over England and beyond for decades. Edward's physical deterioration was unmistakable. The vigor of his youth, the robust frame that had carried him across battlefields from Crécy to Poitiers, now reduced to fragile bones beneath ceremonial robes. His once fiery gaze tempered by the knowledge that his time was nearing its close. Yet, within this weakened form, the mind of the prince remained sharply alive, tracing political currents, weighing alliances, and directing the education of his 10-year-old son Richard with the precision of a seasoned commander, orchestrating a complex campaign. The lessons imparted to the young heir were not merely academic. They were imbued with the subtleties of the importance of balancing noble loyalties, the strategic management of factional power, and the moral compass that should guide a ruler entrusted with the fate of a kingdom. Every meeting with Parliament, every discussion about the administration of lands in Aquitaine, every carefully worded letter to John of Gaunt or continental monarchs reflected the Black Prince's insistence on continuity, on ensuring that the machinery of English governance would not falter in the absence of its most respected and capable figure. Outside the palace, the hum of England continued, unaware, perhaps, of the exact gravity contained within these chambers. Markets, farmlands, and townsfolk moved through their daily rhythms while courtiers maneuvered subtly to position themselves in the wake of a power that would soon be transferred to a boy king. Yet even in this domestic and political quietude, the prince's presence dominated imagination and discourse. Chroniclers of the time noted the sense of awe inspired by his final public appearance in the House of Lords, where, despite his gaunt appearance and the labour of breath, he spoke with clarity and authority on military policy, fiscal reforms, and foreign affairs. reminding all present that while his body had weakened, his mind retained the force that had once reshaped European battlefields. Scholars and poets alike began to document and interpret his life, seeking to capture not just the deeds but the essence of a man whose career had blended martial brilliance, cultural patronage, and political foresight. And yet, amid correspondence, parliamentary sessions, and education of the air, a question lingered in the palace halls. How would England endure the void left by a prince, whose shadow had stretched across the realm, whose strategies had guided kings, and whose death would inevitably alter the balance of power both at home and abroad? As the days of spring deepened into early summer, the atmosphere at Westminster Palace grew heavier, a palpable tension hanging over every audience, every whispered consultation. As the Black Prince's health waned and the inevitability of his passing became a quiet certainty for those who had long admired and feared his presence, despite the encroaching weakness, Edward's mind remained a sharp instrument, meticulously assessing not only the immediate concerns of England's governance but also the delicate, long-term arrangements necessary to secure his son Richard's path to the throne. These were no ordinary preparations. They required an intricate dance of legal formalities, noble assent, and careful management of factional rivalries that might otherwise erupt into conflict at the moment of succession. The prince understood better than most the fragility of authority. He had seen kings falter, alliances crumble, and reputations destroyed, and he was determined that Richard's inheritance would not be marred by similar instability. Letters travelled between England and Aquitaine with precise instructions regarding administration, trade, and military readiness, each word weighed to ensure continuity. To preserve English influence across a continent in which fortunes had already begun to shift away from the crown. Within the palace, the young Richard absorbed lessons that ranged from governance and strategy to the ethical responsibilities of kingship, often under the watchful eye of trusted advisors hand-picked by the prince himself, men whose loyalty, competence, and judgment would shape the formative years of a future monarch. Meanwhile, chroniclers and poets across Europe began circulating narratives of Edward's career and character, framing him as the embodiment of chivalric ideals, even as the shadow of his declining body became a daily reality for those who witnessed it. Courtiers and foreign dignitaries alike were struck by the paradox of a man, simultaneously diminished in form yet commanding in intellect, a figure whose reputation alone influenced political calculations in Paris, Avignon, and beyond. Reports from the French court indicated both anxiety and admiration. Anxiety because the removal of the Black Prince from the political and military stage opened new opportunities for territorial ambition. Admiration because even in decline, his reputation for skill, honor, and strategic vision was acknowledged by friend and foe alike. And yet, behind these calculations and historical documentation lay a human story, a father confronting mortality, a son absorbing the weight of impending kingship, and a kingdom poised at the brink of transition. Each day brought questions not only of succession but of the very survival of English authority in France, the stability of domestic politics, and the cultural memory that would define the Black Prince for generations to come. And so, as June approached, a quiet anticipation settled over Westminster, a mixture of reverence, fear, and unresolved uncertainty, leaving all who observed to wonder when the prince's final breath came. What exact shape would his legacy take in a kingdom on the edge of transformation? June of 1376 arrived with an oppressive stillness that seemed to settle over Westminster Palace, a heavy reminder of the fragile line between life and legacy. As Edward, the Black Prince, lay confined to his bed, his once commanding presence reduced to quiet gasps and fragile movements that betrayed the relentless toll of his chronic illness. Courtiers moved with hushed footsteps, the echoes of their leather shoes and whispered conversations mingling with the faint, steady rustle of parchment as legal documents were reviewed, wills amended, and instructions given to secure England's future under the young Richard, who, at just 10 years old, was slowly beginning to comprehend the enormity of the inheritance awaiting him. Even in these final days, the prince's intellect remained as formidable as his sword arm had once been, his mind dissecting the intricacies of succession, parliamentary cooperation, and international diplomacy with the precision of a master strategist, aware that the absence of his personal authority could unleash political turbulence that might engulf the kingdom once he was gone. Visitors came and went in a continuous, solemn procession. From trusted advisors and family members to foreign emissaries, each audience carefully orchestrated to maintain appearances, gather counsel, and ensure that every decision, every word, carried the weight necessary to stabilize the realm. The young Richard watched and listened, absorbing lessons of prudence, courage, and the delicate balance between mercy and authority, his small hands clutching the edges of the prince's desk as Edward spoke of loyalty, the responsibilities of rule, and the subtle art of navigating noble rivalries without inciting rebellion. Meanwhile, the prince's correspondence with John of Gaunt and other key figures in France detailed strategies for preserving English holdings, maintaining feudal obligations, and managing the complex interplay of commerce and military readiness. Even as the reality of diminished resources and shifting allegiances cast a shadow over these plans, chroniclers across England and Europe began composing accounts that would immortalize his deeds, blending fact and legend, creating an image of a warrior whose courage and tactical brilliance had shaped the course of a century, yet who now faced the same inexorable fate as all men. Religious observances punctuated the days, confessions and prayers intertwining personal piety with the public expectation of preparing a great prince for death, a ritual acknowledgement of the transience of power and the permanence of faith. As Edward's strength waned, the palace seemed suspended between two worlds, the palpable weight of mortal decline and the enduring resonance of a reputation that transcended physical presence. And in this liminal space, where history and destiny intertwined, all who watched and waited could sense the approach of a moment that would forever alter the trajectory of the English crown, leaving one inevitable question lingering in the quiet halls. When the Black Prince's life finally ended, how would the kingdom reconcile the legend with the fragile reality that remained? As the summer of 1376 unfolded, Westminster Palace became a theatre of quiet urgency, where every movement, every whispered instruction, seemed imbued with the weight of history, and Edward, the Black Prince, lay increasingly frail, his once robust frame now drawn and gaunt, a stark reminder of the inevitability that shadows even the greatest of men. The prince's bedchamber, lined with tapestries depicting scenes of battle and heraldic triumph, served as both a sanctuary and a command center, where advisors, courtiers, and family members moved with solemn purpose, balancing grief with the demands of governance, ensuring that no decision critical to England's stability was left unattended. During brief intervals of strength, Edward directed the careful completion of his will, each clause meticulously crafted to safeguard not only his personal estates, but the broader political structures he had labored to secure. A reflection of a mind still as sharp as the sword he once wielded so decisively on fields across France. The young Richard, guided by the prince's patient counsel, began receiving instruction in the nuances of rulership, learning the delicate interplay of loyalty, military command, and moral responsibility, absorbing lessons that his father hoped would shield him from the turbulence awaiting a king ascending at such a tender age. International attention was not absent from this domestic vigil. French emissaries, ever attentive to shifts in English power, recorded Edward's decline with a mix of strategic calculation and genuine respect, acknowledging that the loss of a commander whose campaigns had so consistently challenged French ambitions could rapidly tip the balance of the 100 Years' War, while simultaneously noting the prince's enduring reputation for chivalric virtue and tactical brilliance. Meanwhile, the court and common observers alike watched as the prince navigated the final stages of his illness with a mixture of dignity, stubborn determination, and a profound sense of duty, receiving visitors, issuing instructions, and ensuring that England's military and political machinery remained as cohesive as possible under circumstances that would have paralyzed lesser men. The cultural and religious rituals surrounding Edward's final months, the prayers, confessions, and charitable instructions highlighted not only personal piety, but the broader expectation that even death could serve as a stage for demonstrating virtue, reinforcing the intertwined nature of power, legacy, and morality in medieval society. And as the prince's presence began to fade from the world of the living, a lingering tension settled over the palace. How would England weather the absence of its most formidable warrior? And could the careful arrangements he had orchestrated protect a realm so reliant on his skill and reputation, leaving the kingdom poised on the precipice of uncertainty and history itself holding its breath? The autumn of 1376 brought an eerie stillness to Westminster Palace, the once bustling halls now muted under the shadow of Edward's declining health. And as the Black Prince lay confined to his chambers, the rhythm of English governance subtly shifted, with ministers and nobles manoeuvring in the spaces he had once dominated, aware that the absence of his commanding presence could unravel delicate alliances, forged over decades of military and political expertise, despite the physical frailty that had begun to define his final months. Edward remained a focal point of authority, his voice, though weakened, carrying the weight of experience and a lifetime of victories, and every instruction he issued, every nuance in his correspondence with John of Gaunt and other continental administrators, reflected a mind still keenly attuned to the complexities of English and French politics. Observers noted the stark contrast between the vibrant, commanding figure who had once ridden at the head of armies in Brittany and Poitiers, and the skeletal form that now received ambassadors and household officers with solemn courtesy, the ceremonial robes of state hanging loosely over his diminishing frame, lending him an almost spectral presence, a living symbol of mortality confronting power. Meanwhile, the preparation of his son Richard for kingship intensified, with Edward carefully selecting tutors, guardians, and advisors whose loyalty and competence would shape the young prince's understanding of justice, military command, and the delicate art of diplomacy, ensuring that the transition of authority, though unprecedented in its circumstances, would have a semblance of continuity rooted in his own judgment. Letters sent to Aquitaine, to the English-held territories in France, and to the broader European courts revealed the prince's concern for maintaining English influence abroad. offering tactical advice, reminders of feudal obligations, and counsel on sustaining alliances, as though projecting his presence beyond the walls of his sick chamber, determined to leave no weakness in the structures he had spent a lifetime building. Even the chroniclers, who had followed Edward's exploits for decades, found themselves drawn into a narrative of suspense and reflection, documenting with careful attention the final acts of a life defined by both martial brilliance and political acumen, capturing the paradox of a prince whose fame rested on conquest, yet whose last days were dominated by contemplative care for succession, diplomacy, and legacy. And as whispers of his imminent death circulated through the palace and the wider realm, there was a pervasive sense that history itself was watching, waiting to see whether the meticulous preparations of a man whose courage had shaped the destiny of nations would suffice to secure a fragile future, or whether the kingdom would be cast into the uncertainty of a world suddenly bereft of its most formidable protector, leaving a question suspended in the air. Could the legacy of the Black Prince endure beyond the inevitability of death? As winter deepened in 1376, Westminster Palace seemed to hold its breath, the corridors echoing with the quiet shuffling of courtiers and the hushed whispers of officials navigating the tense balance between duty and grief. And within the prince's chambers, Edward's illness continued its relentless advance, a digestive ailment that had haunted him for years now, leaving him bedridden for longer stretches, his once commanding frame reduced to a fragile silhouette beneath the ceremonial finery of royalty. Yet even in such vulnerability, the Black Prince maintained a presence that commanded attention, a mixture of personal gravitas and the residual aura of battlefield authority that no decline in health could entirely diminish. His conversations, though brief and often interrupted by pain, were deliberate, measured, each word chosen to impart wisdom, assert priorities, and shape the political landscape for his son. And the young Richard, only 10 years old, sat attentively during these sessions, absorbing lessons in governance, military strategy, and the moral imperatives that Edward insisted must guide every king, leaving the impression of a father working against time to imprint his vision on the next generation. Meanwhile, the palace itself became a theatre of intricate political choreography, with noble families and parliamentary factions subtly testing boundaries, gauging loyalties, and anticipating the power vacuum that the prince's death would inevitably create. And in these moments of quiet observation, Edward's understanding of human ambition and factional tension was revealed, as he subtly manipulated alliances, reinforced the authority of trusted allies, and sought to prevent any single courtly faction from dominating Richard's future, demonstrating the tactical acumen that had earned him renown on European battlefields, now redirected toward safeguarding the realm in an era of vulnerability. Correspondence with John of Gaunt, now heavily involved in the administration of English territories in France, reflected the prince's keen awareness of the international stage, offering pragmatic advice about feudal obligations, commercial networks, and the tenuous military positions that would define England's continental presence after his death, as though even from his sickbed he could extend his influence across thousands of miles of contested territory, guiding operations with the precision of a general long accustomed to directing armies and logistics under pressure. Chroniclers and poets of the time, sensing the gravity of these final months, began recording narratives that mingled admiration with foreboding, capturing the paradox of a man whose life had been defined by martial dominance now facing the quiet inevitability of mortality, leaving historians and contemporaries alike to ponder whether the meticulous preparations The careful selection of tutors, advisors, and guardians for young Richard, and the strategic orchestration of alliances would suffice to preserve England's stability, or whether the death of its most celebrated military and political figure would unravel the delicate threads of power, opening the door to uncertainty and the unfolding of events that might shape the realm for decades to come. The spring of 1376 brought both a subtle awakening of activity within Westminster Palace and a haunting awareness of the inevitable, as Edward, the Black Prince, lingered between fleeting moments of strength and prolonged spells of debilitating illness, his digestive affliction exacting a toll that transformed the once formidable warrior into a figure of frailty and reflection. Yet even in his weakened state, the prince's mind remained sharp, calculating, and attuned to the delicate balance of politics, legacy, and succession that would define England's immediate future. And as he received visitors, noblemen, clergy, and officials, all movements were measured, all conversations precise. A subtle orchestration designed to transmit authority and continuity even from a bedside confined by illness. His will, drafted meticulously with the assistance of legal experts versed in English and continental law, became not merely a document of personal disposition, but a blueprint for political and dynastic stability, encompassing the distribution of wealth, the establishment of charitable foundations, and the reinforcement of his son Richard's claim as heir apparent, while also reflecting his enduring commitment to chivalric ideals that had defined his life and campaigns. It was a testament to foresight, combining personal devotion, public responsibility, and the strategic foresight of a prince who had long understood that the survival of a realm depended as much on careful planning as on military might. Discussions with John of Gaunt regarding Aquitaine revealed the prince's acute awareness of the limitations of English control over continental territories, acknowledging that his absence from direct leadership left gaps that would be difficult to fill. Yet he sought to mitigate these risks by imparting detailed counsel on governance, military logistics, and the management of feudal obligations, ensuring that even without his presence, the mechanisms of authority might persist and protect English interests in France. A strategic calculation informed by decades of experience on the battlefield and in administration. Meanwhile, the cultural and literary world responded to the prince's decline with works that celebrated valor, honor, and the virtues of knighthood, a subtle but powerful acknowledgement of the way his reputation had transcended national boundaries to influence European aristocratic consciousness. And as Edward prepared Richard for kingship, sessions of instruction ranged from practical governance to moral philosophy, shaping a young heir in the image of a father determined to leave a legacy of competence, integrity, an awareness of the intricate network of loyalties and obligations that would dictate the success of any ruler. Yet for all the care, all the preparation, there remained an unspoken question echoing through the palace halls and chroniclers. Pence alike, could the careful arrangements of a dying prince truly safeguard a kingdom from the turbulence, ambition, and factional intrigue that awaited beyond his final days? Or was England destined to confront the uncertainties of a throne now passing to a child, with all the perils that such a transition inevitably invited? As June of 1376 approached, the atmosphere within Westminster Palace grew heavy with both anticipation and quiet sorrow, the corridors echoing with the hushed conversations of courtiers and the measured footsteps of attendants, who knew that each day might be the last for England's most celebrated warrior. And yet life in the palace did not pause. Matters of state, correspondence with foreign courts, and discussions of military strategy continued around the prince's sickbed, a stark reminder that the machinery of governance pressed onward even in the shadow of mortality, and Edward, though visibly weakened, remained intellectually engaged, listening, advising, and offering judgments with a clarity that belied his gaunt appearance. His eyes still sharp, scanning documents, maps, and letters, while his mind navigated the labyrinthine politics of England, France, and beyond, plotting courses that could secure his son's inheritance and stabilize a kingdom increasingly conscious of its vulnerability. Visitors arrived in constant flow, from loyal knights to advisors, all seeking guidance, blessings, or the opportunity to witness the final moments of a man whose martial prowess and personal charisma had dominated Europe for decades. And within these meetings, Edward's focus was not merely on the ceremonial, but on the substantive: arrangements for Richard's guardians, the division of his estates, the preservation of alliances, and instructions for the conduct of those who would manage England's interests both at home and abroad. Every word weighed with the authority of experience and the awareness of the brevity of his remaining days. The prince's personal faith intertwined with his political foresight. Confessions and prayers were not merely spiritual exercises, but deliberate acts to fortify his moral legacy and secure divine favor for the challenges awaiting his son, while simultaneously reinforcing the image of piety and honor that had been central to his reputation, a reputation that even in decline commanded respect from allies and adversaries alike. Meanwhile, the news of his condition reverberated beyond England, reaching the courts of France, the papacy, and the wider European nobility, prompting both strategic calculation and genuine admiration, as leaders weighed the consequences of the impending loss of a warrior whose campaigns had reshaped the political landscape of the continent, and chroniclers began to prepare the narrative of a life that would soon conclude. A life whose mixture of glory, controversy, and cultural patronage demanded careful remembrance. Yet in the midst of these calculated preparations, there lingered an undeniable human element: the anxiety, the grief, and the profound awareness of mortality that Edward shared with his family and closest confidants. And as the summer heat of June crept into the palace, a subtle tension grew. The knowledge that the end approached was palpable, a silent drumbeat echoing through the halls, leaving one question hanging in the air, a question that would soon demand an answer from history itself. How would England endure the passing of its prince? And what shadows would his absence cast over the realm he had fought to protect? On June 8, 1376, the day arrived that would mark the conclusion of Edward's life and the beginning of a new chapter for England. A day that combined the intimacy of private grief with the weight of public ceremony, as family members gathered around his bedside in Westminster Palace, their faces etched with sorrow, while advisers, knights, and courtiers observed with solemn reverence, knowing that they were witnessing the final moments of a figure whose presence had dominated the political, military, and cultural life of the nation for decades. And Edward, though weakened almost beyond recognition, retained the calm dignity that had defined him throughout his adult life, offering final words of guidance, encouragement, and reassurance to those gathered, particularly his young son Richard, whose small hands and attentive gaze absorbed lessons of loyalty, duty, and the burdens of kingship, lessons imparted even as the prince's own strength ebbed away. The room was quiet except for the subtle sounds of whispered prayers, the faint rustle of fabric as attendants moved with care, and the occasional turning of parchment a gentle reminder that even in his final hours, Edward remained engaged with the responsibilities that had defined him, a presence that combined authority with vulnerability in a way that left a lasting impression on all who were present. And though the physicians had long exhausted their remedies, there was a sense that the prince's passing would not be marked by suffering alone, but by a carefully orchestrated culmination of life, legacy, and the transmission of knowledge to the next generation. Outside the walls of Westminster, news of Edward's imminent death travelled swiftly, reaching noble families, military commanders, and foreign courts, each reacting in their own way, some with strategic calculation, others with genuine grief, yet all recognizing the profound implications for the balance of power in England and across Europe. For with the Black Prince gone, the mantle of leadership would pass to a 10-year-old heir, whose ability to command loyalty and maintain authority would soon be tested, and the Regency Council, already being organized, prepared to manage this delicate transition, balancing the ambitions of powerful nobles against the need for stability, a challenge that would shape the kingdom for years to come. Meanwhile, Edward's personal preparations, his will, his final instructions, and his advice to Richard reflected a meticulous concern for both the material and moral legacy he would leave behind, a concern that extended from the administration of estates and continental territories to the cultivation of chivalric ideals and the promotion of cultural patronage, a reminder that even in death, Edward's influence would continue to resonate, and as his final breath passed quietly within the chamber, a profound silence settled, a moment that encapsulated the end of an era, leaving the nation to confront the immediate political vacuum, the uncertainties of succession, and the enduring memory of a prince whose life had embodied both the grandeur and the fragility of medieval power, prompting one lingering question: how would England navigate the absence of its most formidable figure? And what shadows would this death cast over the coming reign? The funeral of Edward the Black Prince, held shortly after his death in June 1376, unfolded as both a deeply personal farewell and a calculated public demonstration of authority, a spectacle that merged mourning with political theatre as courtiers, nobles, clergy, and common citizens processed from Westminster Palace toward Canterbury Cathedral, the air heavy with the scent of incense, the echo of solemn chants, and the rhythmic clatter of armored attendants accompanying the funeral bier, each detail meticulously planned to reflect the stature of a man who had embodied the military prowess, political influence, and cultural sophistication of 14th century England, while also signaling continuity in a period fraught with uncertainty. For his son Richard's minority loomed over the proceedings, a reminder that the kingdom now faced the challenge of maintaining stability without the commanding presence of its most celebrated leader. The procession itself stretched for miles, a river of grief, respect, and subtle political signaling, with banners bearing the Black Prince's heraldic symbols fluttering in the wind, the ostrich feathers and motto that had become inseparable from his identity catching the sunlight, casting fleeting shadows across the faces of the assembled, some etched with sorrow, others carefully neutral, reflecting both genuine admiration and calculated concern over how the prince's absence might reshape power dynamics within the court. Inside Canterbury Cathedral, the atmosphere combined the grandeur of medieval ecclesiastical architecture with the intimate solemnity of personal devotion, the high vaulted ceilings reverberating with Gregorian chants, the light filtering through stained glass, painting the stone floors in rich hues of red, blue, and gold, while Edward's tomb, which had been designed to embody both martial achievement and Christian piety awaited its occupant. A testament in stone to the life of a prince whose legacy was as much about ideals as it was about conquest. The effigy atop the tomb, clad in full armor, sword at rest, helmet carefully positioned. A frozen embodiment of the man who had once commanded armies and shaped history. And surrounding him, sculpted angels and saints invoked the divine. A silent witness to the intertwining of earthly power and spiritual duty that had defined his existence. The funeral ceremonies, observed by dignitaries from England and abroad, underscored the international significance of Edward's life. 4 letters and envoys had arrived from France, the papacy, and other European courts, each acknowledging both the loss of a formidable adversary and the passing of a symbol of chivalric virtue, reflecting a delicate balance between respect, fear, and opportunism, as France quietly recalibrated its strategies for reclaiming territories lost under Edward's command, while the papal court reaffirmed its prayers and blessings, weaving religious authority into the narrative of succession and continuity. Yet beneath the ceremonial splendor, subtle tensions rippled through the English nobility, whispers of ambition and concern mingling with grief. For the Regency Council that would govern during Richard II's minority was already a contested space, the absence of Edward's commanding presence leaving a vacuum that would invite negotiation, rivalry, and, inevitably, conflict, a reality that foreshadowed the political turbulence to come, leaving historians and contemporaries alike to wonder, could England maintain unity and purpose in the shadow of a prince whose very presence had once demanded loyalty and defined the rhythm of governance? With the Black Prince laid to rest in Canterbury Cathedral, the focus inevitably shifted to the boy who would inherit a kingdom in turmoil. Richard II, whose 10-year-old shoulders now bore the weight of England's future. And yet, the young prince had been carefully prepared by his father, tutored in matters of governance, diplomacy, and military strategy during the final months of Edward's life. Sitting by his father's bedside as the elder prince imparted lessons in history, justice, and the delicate art of maintaining noble loyalty, each conversation steeped in both affection and the urgency of succession, as Edward understood that his son's ability to command, respect, and wield authority would determine whether England could navigate the fragile period following the death of a leader whose presence alone had stabilized kingdoms and intimidated enemies. The lessons were not merely political, they were moral, emphasizing courage tempered by wisdom, decisiveness balanced with empathy, and above all, the importance of perceiving ambition and loyalty among courtiers. Lessons that Richard absorbed under the watchful eyes of trusted advisors chosen by his father, men whose competence, character, and political alignment had been meticulously evaluated to create a network capable of guiding the young king through the treacherous waters of minority rule. For Edward knew that the absence of his own forceful personality would require structures and individuals who could act in his stead. And yet, the very arrangements that were designed to protect Richard also planted the seeds of tension, as factions within the nobility sensed opportunity in the vacuum left by England's greatest military mind, whispering, maneuvering, and preparing to test the boundaries of influence in ways that would later shape the course of the young king's reign. The Black Prince's foresight extended to legal and constitutional matters, drafting provisions that would legitimize Richard's succession even in the face of potential challenges from ambitious relatives or skeptical barons, establishing frameworks for regency that balanced authority, oversight, and political expediency. Yet no document, no matter how carefully prepared, could fully compensate for the absence of the guiding presence that had once unified a realm, and thus the kingdom stood on the precipice of uncertainty. The lessons from Edward's death echoing through the halls of Westminster and the streets of London, a silent reminder of both human mortality and the fragile foundations of power. As the question lingered in the minds of courtiers and commoners alike, could a boy, no matter how carefully instructed, truly carry forward the legacy of a man whose very name had commanded fear, respect, and devotion across the courts and battlefields of Europe? Or would England, bereft of its Black Prince, find itself unmoored, drifting into the political storms that history seemed always ready to unleash? As the young Richard II began his formal reign under the careful supervision of a regency council, the echoes of his father's presence lingered in every corner of English governance, shaping the decisions of men who both revered and feared the shadow of Edward the Black Prince. John of Gaunt, his uncle and the most senior adult member of the royal family, assumed a dominant position, wielding authority that would have been tempered had the prince still lived. Yet his ambition and controversial policies sparked unease among the nobility, revealing how delicate the balance of power had become, and how much of it had depended on Edward's personal charisma, military reputation, and political acumen, qualities that could not be replicated by even the most skilled advisor. As the kingdom navigated the fragile period of minority rule, grappling with questions of legitimacy, loyalty, and the enforcement of law and order in the absence of a commanding presence, the council, carefully designed to prevent any one faction from seizing dominance, became a theatre of subtle intrigues and veiled competition, where alliances shifted like shadows across the corridors of power, reflecting the very lessons Edward had imparted to his son about the vigilance required to maintain authority. Yet the young king, still absorbing the weight of his inheritance, was often caught between the counsel of experienced statesmen and the reality of a nobility eager to test limits, creating a dynamic in which the strategies, negotiations, and compromises that had defined the Black Prince's career were now replicated in miniature, a rehearsal of power in which the stakes were no less real, and the potential consequences just as severe. The period also saw England attempting to recover from the economic and military burdens left by Edward's campaigns, with fiscal pressures from the Spanish expedition and the costs of maintaining influence in Aquitaine constraining the crown, forcing the regency to make difficult decisions about taxation, trade, and military expenditure, decisions that were closely scrutinized by an increasingly politically aware Parliament, which had already felt the influence of the prince during the Good Parliament of 1376, and whose role in governance would continue to expand as the young king matured. Beyond politics and economics, Richard's upbringing under the memory of his father shaped cultural expectations, instilling ideals of chivalry, piety, and public service, while simultaneously exposing the fragility of authority when it rests too heavily on personal reputation, a lesson that would echo throughout his reign and the challenges that lay ahead, leaving observers to wonder whether the legacy of the Black Prince would empower his son to greatness, or cast an unmanageable shadow over a kingdom already poised on the edge of uncertainty. The memory of Edward the Black Prince loomed over the regency not only in politics and culture, but also in the hearts of England's people, who had celebrated his victories and mourned his suffering, and whose loyalty had often been as personal as it was feudal, creating a collective memory that shaped expectations for leadership, courage, and justice. Tales of his battlefield brilliance, from Crécy to Poitiers, had become legendary, recounted in taverns, courts, and monasteries alike, blending fact and admiration into a narrative that elevated the prince to a near-mythical status, a symbol of martial prowess and chivalric ideals. Yet those same stories were accompanied by whispers of the darker realities of war, including the brutal sackings and massacres that marked the later years of his campaigns. Actions that some chroniclers defended as military necessity while others condemned as moral failings, leaving a complicated portrait of a man whose accomplishments and controversies intertwined inseparably, a duality that fascinated and unsettled his contemporaries, and would continue to challenge historians for centuries. As England looked to the future under Richard II, the example of the Black Prince served as both inspiration and caution, illustrating the heights to which ambition and skill could carry a ruler, but also the vulnerabilities inherent in placing too much authority in a single individual, whose absence could unsettle the kingdom. A lesson the Regency wrestled with in every decision about administration, military readiness, and diplomatic posture, as the fragile alliances forged during Edward's life required constant attention, negotiation, and occasional coercion to prevent fragmentation, a balancing act that revealed the delicate interplay between personal reputation and institutional stability. The cultural impact of the prince also extended into art, literature, and architecture, with his patronage leaving an indelible mark on English society, from the commissioning of tapestries and manuscripts celebrating his achievements to the endowment of religious institutions that would perpetuate his memory and influence social norms, blending martial symbolism with devotional purpose, and reinforcing the image of a prince whose life was inseparable from the ideals of chivalry, piety, and service. Yet despite these enduring legacies, the absence of his guiding hand allowed political tensions, economic pressures, and military challenges to intensify, revealing how closely the kingdom had relied upon the Black Prince's personal judgment, strategic vision, and unifying presence, creating a landscape in which every decision, every alliance, and every confrontation carried the lingering shadow of a figure whose death had changed England irrevocably, leaving the question of how a nation might endure or falter, in the absence of its greatest son, hanging over the coming decades. A silent reminder that even legends cannot shield a realm from uncertainty. As the years following Edward the Black Prince's death unfolded, the Kingdom of England felt the echoes of his absence in ways both subtle and profound, from the quiet unease of courtiers navigating factional rivalries to the strategic recalibrations of military commanders, who could no longer rely on his singular genius to shape campaigns. The young King Richard II, now the inheritor of a vast legacy at just 10 years old, became both a symbol of continuity and a reminder of vulnerability. His every action scrutinized through the lens of his father's shadow, as advisors, nobles, and foreign powers alike weighed their influence against the memory of the man who had commanded armies, earned respect, and instilled loyalty with a presence that transcended mere authority, creating a vacuum that demanded both political skill and opportunistic calculation from those who sought to fill it. Yet even as England adjusted to life without its greatest prince, the memory of Edward's deeds continued to resonate across Europe, with chroniclers in France, Italy, and the Low Countries recording tales of his victories, his magnanimity, and his uncompromising standards of conduct, a reputation that served as both inspiration and warning to rulers, commanders, and soldiers who measured themselves against the benchmark of his life, while simultaneously reminding them that reputation, however grand, cannot safeguard against mortality or the inexorable march of political change. The intricate web of loyalties and obligations he had cultivated in Aquitaine and throughout French territories now faced unprecedented stress, as local lords, merchants, and military leaders navigated the uncertainty left by his departure, some seeking to maintain English control through cautious diplomacy, others exploiting the opportunity to reclaim autonomy, highlighting the fragile balance between charisma-driven authority and structural governance that Edward had so skillfully maintained during his lifetime. In the cultural sphere, the prince's legacy continued to influence artistic and literary expression, with poets, chroniclers, and minstrels weaving his life into allegorical tales of courage, honor, and piety, while architects and patrons drew upon his example to commemorate martial excellence intertwined with devotion, creating a tangible sense of his presence in the sacred and civic spaces of England. A reminder that memory itself could act as both a political tool and a moral compass. Yet beneath these celebrations, questions lingered about the moral ambiguities of his campaigns, the human cost of his conquests, and the implications of leaving a kingdom reliant on the singular authority of a figure whose absence revealed the limits of personal legacy, leaving historians and citizens alike to wonder whether the Black Prince's life was a model to emulate or a cautionary tale about the fragility of power. And in that uncertainty, the story of England after Edward's death begins to unfold, marked by ambition, tension, and the persistent shadow of a prince who had defined an era in the immediate aftermath of the Black Prince's passing. The corridors of power within England seemed suspended between mourning and maneuvering, a delicate tension where grief intertwined with ambition, as nobles and courtiers assessed their positions within a court suddenly bereft of its most commanding figure. John of Gaunt, Edward's surviving brother, emerged as the most prominent adult male within the royal family, a man whose personal ambitions and controversial policies both alarmed and fascinated his peers, creating a landscape of political uncertainty in which alliances shifted like shadows under a fading sun, while the young Richard II's minority placed an unprecedented emphasis on regency governance, highlighting the challenges of maintaining authority when the direct link between sovereign and ruler, the guiding hand of a father, was abruptly severed. The Regency Council, constructed with careful attention to balance and competence during the Black Prince's final months, attempted to safeguard continuity, yet it became immediately clear that no institutional framework could fully replicate the magnetic influence and decisive judgment of a prince who had inspired both fear and loyalty on the battlefield and respect in the halls of power, leaving England's political landscape exposed to the subtle yet relentless pressures of factional rivalries, foreign diplomacy, and domestic unrest. In France, the death of Edward the Black Prince was perceived not merely as the loss of a man, but as the disappearance of a strategic force that had long constrained French ambitions, prompting Charles V and his advisors to re-evaluate territorial plans, capitalize on weakened English command, and accelerate efforts to reclaim regions once firmly under English influence. Yet even in their triumphs, chroniclers noted the enduring admiration for Edward's military skill, personal honor, and chivalric conduct, a paradoxical acknowledgement that his legend extended beyond enmity and into the collective consciousness of Europe, shaping perceptions of leadership, courage, and nobility. Meanwhile, England grappled with the practical consequences of losing a leader who had defined its military strategy, cultural patronage, and political diplomacy, as the administration of Aquitaine and other continental possessions faced renewed instability. reliant now on deputies and family members who could not command the same respect. While domestic governance required careful management of parliamentary relations, noble allegiances and fiscal pressures accumulated during years of war and territorial ambition. The Black Prince's absence also reverberated through the cultural and social spheres, with poets, artists, and chroniclers memorializing his deeds, yet weaving in the moral questions of war, authority, and mortality, reminding England and Europe alike that even legends are vulnerable to time, circumstance, and human imperfection, leaving an open question about the true measure of his legacy, and whether the world he shaped would endure or slowly unravel under forces he had once kept firmly in balance. As the young Richard II assumed the throne in 1377, barely 10 years old and already bearing the weight of a kingdom, the shadow of his father's legacy loomed large over every decision, every council meeting, and every noble negotiation, creating a world in which the absence of Edward the Black Prince's commanding presence became a tangible, almost physical force pressing down upon the court. The Regency Council, tasked with guiding the young king, navigated a precarious balance between loyalty to the crown, personal ambition, and the practical necessities of governance, yet without the stabilizing influence of a military hero whose reputation had once unified factions. Fractures within the nobility became increasingly pronounced, and subtle rivalries threatened to erupt into open conflict. As each lord, each advisor, and each courtier assessed not just the future of the monarchy, but the extent of their own power in a landscape suddenly fluid and uncertain. The cultural memory of Edward's campaigns and public persona influenced these dynamics as well, for his chivalric ideals, military genius, and personal honor created benchmarks against which the competence and morality of his successors were measured, intensifying expectations and scrutiny, while also offering a template for leadership that was simultaneously inspiring and daunting. Meanwhile, abroad, the French continued to exploit the absence of England's greatest commander, with Charles V and his advisors applying pressure along contested borders, assessing weaknesses in English administration, and seeking to reclaim territories that had long been tenuously held. Yet even in these geopolitical maneuvers, chroniclers note that Edward's reputation cast a long shadow, shaping French strategies in cautious, almost reverent ways, acknowledging the tactical brilliance and strategic foresight that had defined decades of conflict, while also recognizing the fragility now inherent in English rule without the prince's hand guiding the military machine. Within England, the economic consequences of Edward's campaigns became more pronounced as the crown struggled to fund ongoing military efforts, maintain garrisons in Aquitaine, and stabilize domestic finance, with the financial burdens of previous wars weighing heavily upon the treasury and magnifying the challenges faced by advisors and regents attempting to govern effectively at the same time. The education and moral formation of Richard II, carefully overseen by the Black Prince in his final months, proceeded under the watchful eyes of a council and selected guardians, yet without the daily presence of a father whose judgment had commanded unquestioned respect. The young king's understanding of authority, loyalty, and governance was inevitably shaped by observation, rumor, and second-hand instruction, leaving open the question of how much of his father's legacy would endure intact and how much would be eroded by time, ambition, and circumstance, a tension that would quietly, inexorably influence the fate of England. In the decades to come, the delicate political equilibrium established during the early years of Richard II's reign revealed just how profound The vacuum left by Edward the Black Prince's death had become, as noble factions maneuvered subtly, sometimes overtly, to expand their influence while simultaneously maintaining the semblance of loyalty to the young king. Courtiers whispered in corridors, alliances shifted like sand underfoot, and the lessons imparted by the prince, though carefully designed to instill discipline, wisdom, and the ideals of chivalry, competed with the self-interest and ambition that naturally arose in a court suddenly devoid of its strongest anchor, a phenomenon that some historians suggest sowed the seeds of the political crises that would later engulf Richard's reign, exposing vulnerabilities in a monarchy whose authority relied as much on perception and reputation as on law and lineage. The cultural and symbolic presence of the Black Prince remained powerful, however, shaping ceremonies, public memory, and even the expectations of commoners who had seen in him a figure of military prowess and personal honor, a standard against which all rulers would be judged. Yet his absence created a silent tension, a constant reminder that the security, decisiveness, and strategic genius that had once defined English foreign policy were no longer guaranteed, leaving advisors and generals to grapple with decisions that might once have been guided by the prince's keen judgment. In France, the consequences were equally palpable. As military planners recalibrated strategies, knowing that England's foremost tactician, whose campaigns had redefined battlefield tactics and inspired fear across the continent, was gone, and in his place, a child king presided over a kingdom with experienced soldiers, but lacking the singular command that had once unified them, encouraging some to predict that territorial gains might finally slip from English hands, while others believed that the systems and reforms the prince had implemented, logistical organization, disciplined armies, and carefully managed feudal obligations, might continue to protect England from immediate collapse. A fragile hope that relied heavily on institutional memory rather than personal genius. Domestically, the economic pressures left by the prince's campaigns, combined with ongoing administrative reform efforts, created a complex web of fiscal and bureaucratic challenges that tested the capacity of regents and advisors, revealing both the foresight of Edward's policies and the limitations of his absence simultaneously. Richard's education, which included lessons in diplomacy, military theory, and moral conduct, became a crucial focal point. Yet the young king's understanding of power, justice, and loyalty was inevitably filtered through a council of advisors with their own priorities, making the question of whether Edward's legacy would endure in spirit as well as in law a central, lingering mystery that would quietly shape England's political landscape for generations. Even as Richard, II's minority, unfolded under the careful but cautious watch of a regency council, the shadow of Edward the Black Prince loomed over every decision, every council meeting, every strategic choice, as if his presence lingered in the corridors of power, reminding all who served of the weight of duty, honor, and military brilliance that once defined the kingdom. Courtiers spoke his name with reverence, their words carrying both nostalgia and anxiety, aware that without the prince's guiding hand, the balance between ambition and loyalty could tip with dangerous consequences, leaving the crown vulnerable to manipulation or miscalculation beyond the palace walls. The common people remembered a prince whose courage and reputation had inspired confidence and awe, who had not only led armies to victory but had also symbolized a continuity of strength and justice. And in those recollections, his death created an invisible void, a gap between expectation and reality that few could fully articulate. Yet all felt in the shifting tone of governance and the uncertainty that seemed to linger over the kingdom like a morning fog. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, French observers watched closely, recognizing that with the Black Prince gone, their adversary's strategic brilliance was diminished. Yet some noted that the institutional reforms, logistical networks, and trained commanders he had cultivated might delay the anticipated collapse, producing a tense and unpredictable geopolitical environment where each action carried consequences far beyond immediate comprehension, and where the lessons of one fallen leader still resonated like echoes in the halls of power. Within England, the regents faced the delicate task of maintaining noble loyalty, balancing rival factions, and enforcing law and policy without the authority that the prince's military and political reputation had naturally commanded. A challenge compounded by lingering financial strains from campaigns past, unresolved territorial disputes, and the intricate web of feudal obligations that required careful navigation to prevent rebellion or discontent. And all the while, they attempted to honor Edward's memory, preserve his reforms, and instill in Richard the same principles of leadership, courage, and judgment that had made his father legendary. Yet each decision revealed how irreplaceable the Black Prince had been, how personal charisma and battlefield acumen could not simply be codified or delegated, leaving the kingdom suspended between the lessons of the past and the uncertainties of the future. A liminal space where history had paused, waiting to see if the ideals and strategies of a single extraordinary life could endure through bureaucracy, mentorship, and memory, or whether the absence of such singular brilliance would eventually allow political ambition, factional tension, and foreign opportunism to reshape the trajectory of England entirely. A question that hung silently, unresolved, over the young king and his realm. As the regency of Richard II took shape, whispers of both hope and apprehension threaded through the halls of Westminster and the noble estates of England. For while Edward the Black Prince's passing had left a void, it had also left a carefully constructed blueprint of governance, a map of political alliances, and a vision of loyalty cultivated through decades of personal authority and battlefield success. Yet the young king, barely 10, could not command armies or command respect by mere presence, and the adults surrounding him trusted advisors. Loyal nobles and cautious regents were left to translate Edward's principles into practice, balancing competing ambitions while keeping the young monarch's safety and authority intact. A task made more complex by the lingering memories of the prince's military genius, which set a standard no one could easily emulate, leaving a subtle but palpable tension between reverence for his legacy and the pressing need for practical governance. Beyond the immediate political sphere, Edward's death resonated throughout the European continent, with courts from Paris to Avignon noting the end of an era, the fading of a warrior whose campaigns had shaped alliances, inspired fear, and altered the strategic calculus of kings and generals. And while some French sources expressed optimism that English resistance might weaken without the Black Prince at its helm, others could not ignore the structures he had left behind, the trained captains, disciplined troops, and tactical doctrines that continued to influence military campaigns and would persist for decades, subtly shaping conflicts in ways no single observer could predict. Within England, the economic pressures left from years of warfare and territorial administration became increasingly apparent, as the crown struggled to reconcile outstanding debts, military expenditures, and the obligations to maintain loyalty among the nobility, a delicate financial tightrope that Edward had navigated with skill, but which now rested upon the inexperienced shoulders of a regency, revealing how intertwined military success, fiscal prudence, and political stability had been in the prince's life. and how precarious they could become in his absence. Meanwhile, cultural memory began to take shape, as chroniclers, poets, and minstrels recorded the deeds of the Black Prince in verse and tale, transforming historical events into legend, emphasizing valor, honor, and loyalty, while sometimes softening or omitting the morally ambiguous choices of his later campaigns, creating a narrative that would endure for centuries, a mixture of fact, perception, and idealization, ensuring that even in death, Edward's presence would continue to guide the imagination, the politics, and the strategic consciousness of England, leaving a lingering question for all who followed. Could the memory of one extraordinary life continue to shape the destiny of a kingdom? Or would the inevitable passage of time and human ambition eventually erode even the most brilliant of legacies? As the years following Edward the Black Prince's death unfolded, the young Richard II grew under the careful but imperfect guidance of the Regency Council, a body designed to preserve stability yet inevitably fractured by competing interests, rivalries, and the lingering shadow of a father whose presence had once unified both court and army. The council included figures such as John of Gaunt, whose ambition and political maneuvering created subtle tensions, and loyal nobles who remembered Edward's insistence on justice, military competence, and the careful balance of power, all attempting to mold the boy king in ways that reflected both personal agendas and the ideals instilled by his father, while the wider nobility watched closely, aware that the absence of a commanding military leader like Edward exposed weaknesses in royal authority and created openings for influence, dissent, or opportunism, making each decision a delicate negotiation, where loyalty was constantly weighed against ambition, and every alliance bore the potential for both security and betrayal. Across the countryside, echoes of the Black Prince's campaigns lingered in the memories of soldiers, peasants, and administrators alike, with tales of victories at Crécy and Poitiers told beside the hearths, recounting both courage and devastation, shaping perceptions of leadership, honor, and the costs of war, creating an enduring cultural framework in which the young king's legitimacy would be interpreted and contested. As his father's shadow loomed large over every battlefield, every tax levy, and every ceremonial court gathering, simultaneously, continental powers observed England's delicate transition, with the French crown quietly recalculating strategies, considering opportunities to reclaim lost territories, yet tempered by respect for the military systems and leaders Edward had trained, whose knowledge and discipline ensured that English power, while less centralized, remained formidable. A reminder that one life, through meticulous preparation and lasting influence, could continue to shape geopolitical landscapes long after death. Within England, the strain of maintaining financial stability, supporting military readiness, and ensuring political cohesion tested the Regency's skill, revealing both the foresight of Edward's policies and the vulnerabilities inherent in reliance upon a singular, exceptional figure to hold complex systems together, while at the same time the cultural and moral example he left. Chivalry piety provided a template against which every act of governance, military decision, and public conduct would be measured, an invisible standard that weighed heavily on those charged with guiding the young king, creating an atmosphere where every choice seemed haunted by the question of whether it would meet the legacy of Edward the Black Prince, leaving observers to ponder the fragile interplay between memory, ambition, and the inexorable passage of power, and whether the imprint of one extraordinary life could ever truly be matched by those who followed. The legacy of Edward the Black Prince extended far beyond politics and military strategy, seeping into the cultural imagination of England and Europe, where poets, chroniclers, and artists sought to capture the essence of a man whose life seemed larger than the turbulent century he inhabited. And in doing so, they created a mythology that blended fact with admiration, exaggeration, and occasionally moralizing critique. Tapestries, illuminated manuscripts, and public inscriptions commemorated his victories, while minstrels recounted the stories of Crécy and Poitiers in villages and courts alike, turning battles into enduring narratives of courage, honor, and the complexities of martial leadership, so that even generations removed from the 100 Years' War would come to understand the Black Prince as a symbol of chivalric excellence. Yet not without the shadows of controversy, as later, scholars and local witnesses debated the human cost of his campaigns, including the Siege of Limoges, where ruthless decisions revealed the tension between idealized knighthood and the brutal realities of medieval warfare, reminding all who reflected on his life that glory often required sacrifice, moral compromise, and the exercise of power with consequences that reverberated long after the banners had been lowered. At the same time, his influence on military organization and the professionalization of English armies created structural changes that persisted throughout the remainder of the 14th century, from the refinement of longbow tactics to the integration of combined arms strategies, ensuring that even in his absence, the methods he perfected continued to shape both defense and conquest, leaving French, Castilian, and other European powers constantly aware that English military innovation had a mind behind it that could not be easily replaced. His personal example of piety, patronage, and careful stewardship of both lands and subjects reinforced cultural ideals that extended into architecture, charitable foundations, and legal precedents, demonstrating a vision of princely responsibility that merged spiritual devotion with worldly authority, while also embedding a moral framework for future rulers to emulate or resist, depending on the pressures of circumstance. Yet, beneath the grandeur of effigies and tombs, beneath the poetry and chronicles, lay the unsettling question of human mortality and the fragility of dynastic planning. For all the Black Prince's preparation could not prevent the political turbulence that followed, nor fully safeguard a young king untested by war or adversity, leaving historians and casual observers alike to wonder how much of his genius was inherent, how much cultivated, and whether the lessons of a single extraordinary life could ever truly endure in the unpredictable currents of history. A question whose echoes would ripple through time, from one generation to the next, always hinting at mysteries yet unresolved, and inviting the listener to follow the story further into the shadows of medieval England. Even as Edward of Woodstock's physical presence faded from the courts and battlefields of Europe, the perception of the Black Prince in contemporary memory began to take on a life of its own, transforming him from a historical figure into an emblem of martial and moral ideals that transcended his own era. And in this transformation, the boundaries between legend and recorded fact became increasingly fluid, as chroniclers from England, France, and Italy alike recounted his victories with dramatic flourish, sometimes omitting failures or ethical complications in favor of crafting a narrative that highlighted courage, loyalty, and the unshakable dignity of a warrior prince whose personal valor could inspire generations. Yet beneath these stories lay the tangible consequences of his campaigns, the devastated lands, the dislocated populations, and the enduring tensions with French nobility that would echo for decades, showing that legacy is never simply the memory of deeds, but the ongoing impact of choices made in the crucible of history. Some historians suggest that the Black Prince's careful preparation for his unson's succession and the structuring of a regency council reflected a profound understanding of political continuity, revealing a man not only of action but of foresight, whose concern for governance extended beyond the immediacy of warfare into the abstract, an often perilous realm of institutional stability, while others argue that his premature death left critical gaps that ultimately destabilized the monarchy, raising questions about the fragility of dynastic planning and the extent to which any individual, no matter how capable, can shape the long-term trajectory of a nation. Simultaneously, the Black Prince's personal reputation for piety and chivalric conduct contributed to a cultural ideal that became a benchmark for English nobility, influencing everything from courtly behavior to literary themes, and inspiring poets and chroniclers to weave tales of honor, loyalty, and the moral responsibilities of leadership into the collective consciousness, often emphasizing the prince's generosity toward allies and his meticulous attention to matters of justice and governance, yet always shadowed by the stark realities of his military campaigns, the loss of life, and the harsh pragmatism required to maintain power in both England and its continental territories, leaving a layered and sometimes contradictory portrait of a figure simultaneously celebrated and critiqued. From the elaborate tomb at Canterbury Cathedral to the administrative records and correspondence preserved across Europe, Edward's presence remained palpable, a reminder that history is not static, and that the deeds of one extraordinary individual can reverberate in ways that shape political, cultural, and military landscapes for centuries, challenging each new generation to weigh courage against consequence, honor against necessity, and to ask whether the ideals represented by a man like the Black Prince are timeless, or forever entwined with the shadows of human ambition and mortality, a question that lingers, inviting us to look deeper, to listen closely, and to follow the story into the final layers of its enduring mystery, as we move into the final chapters of Edward the Black Prince's influence. It becomes clear that his legacy was not only defined by the battles he fought or the territories he governed, but by the intricate web of social, political, and cultural structures he helped shape. And in considering these layers, one realizes that the prince's life offers a lens into the tensions of 14th century Europe, where chivalry and brutality coexisted, and where the ideals of knighthood were constantly tested against the practical demands of leadership and survival. From the perspective of English nobility, the Black Prince embodied an archetype of martial excellence, a living symbol of national pride and military prowess, whose mere presence on the battlefield could intimidate opponents and galvanize allies. Yet his final years reveal a more contemplative figure, a man concerned with the institutional frameworks that would outlast him, carefully negotiating the succession of his son Richard and establishing mechanisms to preserve continuity during a period of unprecedented uncertainty, while simultaneously attending to the spiritual and moral dimensions of his life, ensuring that his military actions, often ruthless and consequential, were reconciled, at least ceremonially, with religious duty and personal conscience. Historians examining his correspondence and legal arrangements note the sophistication with which he managed the delicate balance of power between the crown, the nobility, and parliamentary structures, understanding that influence was not solely derived from charisma or conquest, but through careful planning, alliances, and the foresight to mitigate disputes that might threaten the stability of the realm. And yet, for all this meticulous preparation, his premature death left the English monarchy in a vulnerable position, highlighting the limits of individual control in the flow of historical events and casting a shadow over the promising foundations he had laid for Richard's reign. At the same time, cultural reflections on the Black Prince began to proliferate, with poets, chroniclers, and artists emphasizing both his heroic image and the moral lessons embedded in his career, portraying a man whose life was a continuous negotiation between glory and responsibility, ambition and ethical consideration, and whose story would resonate in the collective imagination far beyond the immediate political and military consequences of his campaigns. Through monuments, tombs, heraldry, and literary tribute, Edward's presence persisted, offering successive generations a model of knightly virtue, intertwined with the sobering reality that even the greatest leaders are subject to mortality, circumstance, and the unpredictability of history. And so, as we trace the final echoes of his life across Europe, from the quiet halls of Westminster to the ceremonial grandeur of Canterbury, we are left to ponder the true measure of a legacy. Is it the memory of victories, the structures left behind, or the ideals projected onto a figure who has passed, leaving behind a story that continues to haunt, inspire, and challenge all who encounter it? Next, we turn to the intricate aftermath of Edward the Black Prince's death, a period in which the reverberations of his life continued to shape English politics, society, and culture, where the absence of his commanding presence created a vacuum that tested the resilience of institutions he had helped mold, and where the young Richard II, only 10 years old, stepped into a world already poised on the edge of instability, under the careful yet fragile guidance of a Regency Council whose members were as much rivals as guardians, balancing ambition against loyalty in a landscape defined by factional intrigue. The Regency itself became a delicate experiment in governance, where the memory of the Black Prince's authority both constrained and inspired those in power, forcing them to act within the shadow of a man whose reputation for fairness, strategic brilliance, and military dominance had commanded unprecedented respect, and yet whose absence highlighted the vulnerabilities inherent in hereditary monarchy, where the capacity of one individual had long dictated the fate of kingdoms, and where the question of sustaining order without that central figure became a pressing, almost philosophical dilemma. Contemporaries noted the unease that permeated courtly and political life, as nobles calculated the potential for advantage while wary of the public's reverence for the prince, and chroniclers recorded the subtle shifts in alliances, the quiet negotiations behind closed doors, and the ceremonial gestures designed to maintain the illusion of continuity, all while the memory of Edward's strategic acumen lingered in the minds of those entrusted with guiding a young king whose formative years were now shaped as much by absence as presence, whose education, moral instruction, and understanding of governance were filtered through the lens of advisors, and whose capacity for leadership would inevitably reflect both the preparation laid by his father and the fractures revealed in the wake of his passing. Beyond politics, the cultural and symbolic impact of the Black Prince's life intensified, as artists, heralds, and writers codified his image into lasting icons of knighthood and Christian virtue, emphasizing valor, loyalty, and piety, while often glossing over the moral ambiguities and controversies of campaigns like Limoges, creating a dual legacy of admiration and unresolved questions that would linger in the European imagination for generations. Simultaneously, the financial and territorial consequences of his campaigns, especially in Aquitaine and southwestern France, imposed ongoing constraints on English military policy, shaping fiscal strategies, strategic priorities, and the collective memory of English authority abroad, ensuring that the Black Prince's presence, though absent in body, remained, a defining force in the decisions, ambitions, and anxieties of those left to navigate a kingdom still echoing with the resonance of his extraordinary life, leaving us to wonder how the shadow of a single figure can dominate both the hearts of men and the course of nations, long after the final breath has been drawn. As we move deeper into the enduring legacy of Edward the Black Prince, we enter the realm where memory, legend, and historical record intertwine, creating a narrative that is part fact, part idealization, and entirely compelling, where the line between the man and the symbol becomes almost indistinguishable, and where generations would look back upon his life as a blueprint of medieval chivalry, military genius, and princely responsibility. The stories told in chronicles, poems, and civic accounts from the late 14th century onwards often emphasized his virtues, his courage on the battlefield, his devotion to duty, and his unwavering sense of honor. But these narratives also revealed the human desire to preserve a figure larger than life, a man whose presence had commanded loyalty, inspired awe, and instilled fear, yet whose mortality reminded contemporaries of the fragility of power and the inevitability of succession, of change, and of time itself. Historians note that the Black Prince's campaigns, particularly those in France, not only redefined military strategy for the English army, but also left a cultural imprint with new standards for discipline, coordination, and tactical integration, where cavalry, infantry, and archers were orchestrated with precision that would influence warfare for decades, and where his insistence on merit, leadership, and logistical foresight became lessons passed down through generations of commanders, some of whom would emulate his methods, while others would struggle under the shadow of his legacy. The prince's patronage of arts, architecture, and religious institutions further reinforced his imprint, as the buildings he commissioned, the charitable foundations he supported, and the literary works he inspired projected an image of a ruler who was not only a warrior but also a cultivator of culture, whose taste, piety, and refinement set benchmarks for English aristocracy, subtly weaving political influence with aesthetic authority, and ensuring that his memory would endure in both stone and story. Yet perhaps the most profound aspect of his legacy lies in the psychological and institutional challenges left behind a young king thrust into power, a regency balancing ambition and loyalty, a kingdom navigating financial strain, contested territories, an evolving parliamentary authority, all while the memory of a father, warrior, and statesman loomed over every decision, shaping choices, alliances, and fears, creating a historical echo that historians still examine for its lessons in governance, leadership, and the interplay between personal reputation and political stability. And so, as the centuries unfolded, Edward the Black Prince remained not merely a figure of past glories, but a touchstone for the complexities of power, the demands of leadership, and the enduring allure of a life that seemed to combine both mortal struggle and immortal legend, leaving us to ponder how history remembers not only deeds, but the spirit behind them, and how the shadow of one extraordinary man can stretch across generations, shaping memory, identity, and aspiration in ways that time alone cannot erase. And so we arrive at the final chapter in the life and legacy of Edward the Black Prince, a figure whose story continues to echo through the corridors of history, a man whose deeds on the battlefield, in the halls of power, and within the intimate spaces of family and personal reflection created a narrative both monumental and hauntingly human, where courage, ambition, strategy, and compassion collided in the crucible of 14th century England and France. His death in 1376 marked the end of an era defined by martial brilliance and political acumen. Yet it also signaled the beginning of new uncertainties. As a young Richard II inherited a crown that bore not only the weight of national expectation, but also the immense shadow of a father whose presence had shaped the very fabric of English governance and identity. The Black Prince's influence persisted in subtle ways. The Regency Council, carefully structured alliances, and succession plans all reflected his foresight. Yet none could fully substitute for the personal authority and charisma that he had wielded with unmatched skill, leaving England to navigate the turbulent waters of leadership without the stabilizing force of its greatest military mind. Across the continent, his reputation as a warrior prince commanded attention, respect, and, in some cases, fear, as French leaders recalibrated strategies in response to his absence. Recognizing that the balance of power he had maintained through sheer tactical genius and indomitable will was now irrevocably altered, and that the fragile equilibrium of war, diplomacy, and feudal obligation would never again be quite the same. Culturally, the Black Prince's legacy endured in stone. Parchment and verse from the tomb in Canterbury Cathedral that combined martial symbolism with religious devotion, to the chronicles and literary tributes that celebrated valor, honor, and chivalric ideals, all serving as reminders not only of what he had achieved, but of the ideals he represented, the standards he set, and the stories he inspired. Stories that would shape perceptions of knighthood, leadership, and nobility for centuries to come. Yet within these narratives linger questions that historians and enthusiasts alike continue to explore, about the moral ambiguities of war, the burdens of command, the interplay between personal ambition and public duty, and the ways in which a single life can influence the destinies of nations. And so, as we reflect on Edward the Black Prince, we are invited to sit back, let the weight of history settle around us, and consider the extraordinary convergence of skill, circumstance, and character that produced a man remembered as much for the legend he became as for the life he lived, leaving an imprint that is impossible to ignore, an enduring echo of courage, strategy, and human complexity that still resonates in the annals of history, whispering across time, inviting us to wonder, to question, and to imagine what it truly meant to be both a prince and a warrior, a father and a legend.